I don't have the scientific numbers to back this up, but I would wager that Paris might be one of the top 5 cities in the world when it comes to a location being the backdrop for an expat-related movie or show. Seriously, there are quite a few. An American in Paris, Before Sunset, even Pixar's Ratatouille, and the aptly titled Emily in Paris are all set in the City of Light. It seems to be the go-to spot for creating the atmosphere of a young person or animated cartoon who wants to move to a new city in a new country to chase a dream. And that could be Whitney Marin's story. A few years removed from college, she left New York to pursue her dreams of working in film and art in France. She's currently an international sales assistant at Art France and previously worked as an associate producer with boutique production companies, True Films, and Critical Findings. And in 2021, Whitney launched Current, an innovative bilingual web series and podcast featuring conversations between millennials about the global state of our society. In this episode, Whitney shares how studying abroad experiences in France and India solidified her goal of working in the film industry abroad. She discusses her experiences as an au pair that got her in the country and the eventual transition into the art industry. She also takes a deep dive into the nuances of storytelling in her adopted home and her motivation for launching her series. Now, let's be clear. Even living in Paris has its ups and downs. But for Whitney, she's definitely living out her dreams. Welcome to the Global Chatter. So I'm going to start saying that when I start recording these episodes, they're almost always early morning for me. And I see Whitney smiling because I seem to pick people whose days have already or halfway completed and mine is just starting. So this is my fun way of saying, ignore my voice because this is my my morning voice. And I want to say welcome to Whitney, who you guys have already, heard her introduction. So Whitney, how are you doing today?
I am good. It is about 2 p.m. in Paris. So yes, as you said, my day is started a little bit, but I love a good Saturday afternoon. It's a nice time of day for me.
Okay, I'm glad you said 2 p.m. For me, for those of you who want to do the math, it is 8 a.m. so we're both in very different stages of our day. And I anticipate that this is going to be an exciting episode because I think Whitney's got a really fresh perspective that we haven't heard on the show, and I'm pretty excited. And so here's how I like to start, or at least how I'd like to start lately. I like to give people context. So just tell us where you are right now. And you may have actually already said it, so ignore me because it's the morning.
Yeah, so I am currently in Paris, not too far from the 17th arrondissement. The weather has been quite crazy in Paris recently, but today we have sunshine. So yeah, all is well. Spring is starting to take effect.
Okay, when you say crazy, has it been cold, snowy, hot, warm, windy, rainy?
Yeah, literally last week, it was so beautiful and there was so much sun and I changed my wardrobe like slightly. And then yesterday there was snow.
Okay, legit. I just interviewed someone who was in Austria and he said the same thing. He was like, it was like great. And we were like, okay. And now it's like a snowstorm. And I'm like, I don't understand. Maybe climate change, just putting that out there. But
yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
Summer is my favorite time in Paris because it's beautiful and there are fewer tourists. But spring is also really nice. I'm just really waiting for it to get here and be officially spring.
So, that's a really interesting thing you just said. I'm just curious. So are there fewer tourists in the summer? Like fewer from France or just fewer in general are in Paris?
Oh, sorry. I meant to say fewer people except for tourists, but also in the COVID years, there have been fewer tourists. So in general, summer is pretty empty because Parisians like to go on vacation. There's a lot of people traveling and it's just like a different vibe in the city. And I love it. It's just nice. You go on walks. You don't, this actually I'm from the US in New York, and the sun sets at around 8 p.m. pretty much all year round. There's like, daylight savings time and all that. But in the summer in Paris, the sun sets at around 10 p.m. and it's literally magical. It's like you have such a long day and you just, enjoy.
And you're right, thinking about COVID, because I anticipate, though, with the world starting to open up, and probably by the time this airs, it'll be summer, you might have like a rush of folks because people haven't been able to. And in terms of tourists, I think the Parisians are going to still continue what the Parisians do because that's what they do. But I think you're going to get a rush of like folks who are going to be like, oh my gosh, we haven't been able to travel in X amount of years. I wanted to go to Paris, or Paris is my favorite city. And so kind of prepare yourself for that.
All right. I wouldn't mind it too much. I don't like have a strong opinion about tourists, but I just like emptier, like an emptier Paris is a more romantic Paris for me. But we'll see. We'll see how many tourists show up this summer.
So you've already given a little bit of insight in terms of your life. So you grew up in New York, is that correct?
So I was born in New York, and then when I was 8, I moved to Florida. So I actually grew up most of my life in Florida until I moved back to New York to go to college.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So tell me a little bit about that, because one of our themes is definitely kind of cross-cultural living, and I know it's still within the United States, but New York and Florida are not the same. So, so where in Florida were you?
Yeah, so it's a small town called Cape Coral. In my mind, it's a small town. Maybe geographically and like population-wise, it's not that small, but it's the kind of town where everyone knows their neighbors. I went to the same schools with, the same groups of people. So for me, that was like real suburbia. You had football games and cheerleaders and all the Americana that people, like a lot of Parisians think that's like very interesting and like American. And for me, it was just kind of normal. And then New York, on the other hand, I have some family in Long Island, but also just the city is just a whole different dynamic. It's very urban. You have a lot of things going on. And I think I would have been a completely different person if I grew up in a city. I think having grown up mostly in the suburbs and in a more like chill, like Floridian, always sunshine kind of environment really, has really shaped me. And I'm glad to have had kind of the best of both worlds, in my opinion.
So was the early years in New York particularly around the city as opposed to upstate or some other parts of the state?
Yeah. I have been living in Manhattan and in Queens.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's totally different. That's what I'm trying to imagine making that move. And obviously you moved to Florida when you were 8, so a little bit younger, right? But I'm trying to even imagine making that move as like a preteen or a teenager. I think I would have been like, I just left the city where there's a bazillion movies made about it and everybody wants to go there. And
culture shock. Well, I grew up also over my summers while I was living in Florida. I spent a lot of time in New York. So that's why it's weird because people get kind of confused when I say, I'm from New York and Florida. They're like, what do you mean? Those are like two very different and like geographically far places. But for me, I feel like these two places have quite shaped me. And it's weird for me to say I'm from New York, and it's weird for me to say that I'm from Florida. So I kind of always throw in the two of them.
So obviously there's domestic travel there. Did your family travel to other places within the country, or did you do any kind of international travel?
So I mostly started traveling when I went to college. This was really the first time I was like living away from home, and there were all of these different opportunities in terms of like spring breaks or study abroad or summer opportunities. So that's when I really kind of explored that, mostly to travel domestically, but also I had two different study abroad experiences in college. One was in Paris and the other one was in Mumbai in India.
Okay, so those are also two very different.
Yes.
Like I feel like you are becoming the queen of like extremes and parallels, right? It's like I was in the city in New York and now I was in Florida. And then I, went to France and then I went to India, right?
Yes.
And so I mean, I don't know if you've ever kind of thought about it, but it's really interesting how you sort of, and I don't want to say they're extremes, they each have their own uniqueness to it in good ways and in bad ways, right? But that's a pretty different, I hope you recognize that. Obviously you lived it, but that's a very different choice, I would say, when I hear most people say, I studied abroad and kind of the different places they went.
Well, for me, I guess I had always been really passionate about France and about French culture in Paris for some reason. So I knew that was a place that I wanted to study abroad. And then for India, I had been studying film and television, and this whole program was about Bollywood. So I was like, I cannot pass up this opportunity.
Right.
I was so excited to do that. And that's kind of where those two experiences kind of came into play.
So it seems to me that when you went to college, you already knew that, and, you know, full disclosure, I think you went to Syracuse.
Yes.
Okay. But it seems like to me that you already had a plan that you were going to study abroad. Does that sound kind of fair? Or is that something that you thought you would do?
Well, before I went to college, the only thing that I knew that I wanted to do, just from, you know, researching all the different universities that I was applying to, was going to Syracuse's, the Newhouse School's LA semester program. I knew that I wanted to spend some time in LA, but that was technically like more of like a domestic study abroad, if you will.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really sure what programs I could do internationally. For some reason, it didn't really cross my mind until freshman year. And I was just looking at what I could potentially do. And that's when I was like, wow, like this would be amazing. And study abroad kind of became a part of my plan that year.
And the reason I always highlight this is that, you know, we have folks who kind of who are across all kinds of, you know, just aspects of life, parents, whatever. And what's always really interesting to me, especially talking to Black expats, is how many of them had a study abroad experience. Like there's some key experiences that kind of foreshadowed that they would live abroad. Study abroad's a big one, right? Whether it happened in college, there's some people that it actually happened in high school. You know, I've had a couple of people who parents were in the military. And so they had some kind of experience living on a base somewhere outside. And then folks whose parents, where one person at least had an immigrant identity. This seems to be like the most common thread with the vast majority of folks, study abroad being one of the biggest ones. Occasionally I have some folks on here who none of that was their story. And they went on a trip as an adult and just decided, like Dr. Carmen Brown, you know what, let us live in Australia and New Zealand. and that episode, by the way, if you haven't listened to it, it's a great episode. But, you know, just you talking about, you know, getting to college. And I think this is a lot of people, they don't think this is a thing. And then all of a sudden, you know, our universities are doing a better job of saying, hey, you could study abroad. And so,
definitely.
Yeah. So I feel like that makes sense. I mean, if you had no reason to think about it, freshman year seems to make sense or sophomore year that you would be exposed to it.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like a lot of my friends were figuring out where they wanted to go. It was like a whole thing of how to design your 4 years in college to make sure that you, really got the most out of the experience and for all that you were paying to go to school. So It's really, definitely a big opportunity that I think opened the doors for a lot of people to really think about living abroad after college.
So let me ask this. You know, you identified both France and India. I'm very interested. Which opportunity came first? Was it the French experience?
Yes. So the French experience, it was actually a program called Paris Noir, and it was all about Black expats in Paris, the Harlem Renaissance, the Negritude movement. So it was really focused on literature. And it was with the professor that I had a class with the semester before. I was so excited to really go on this program. And I knew that the Bollywood program existed, but it wasn't every single year. So I kind of had to wait on that one. But traveling for the first time abroad to Paris, I think was the best kind of way that could have happened, because it wasn't about being abroad. It was about this specific kind of period of time of literature that I was interested in. And of course, the city of Paris. But then that opened my mind to, you know, what else there is abroad and what opportunities there are for people to live and to work and to just have all these different sorts of experiences.
Yeah, I think Paris is a fascinating place when you talk about Black history and Black culture. Early on, I think around season 1, I had Kevin Donat of Le Paris Noir. And, you know, I've known Kevin virtually for almost since the beginning, since I did this thing. Because, you know, he comes from Martinique and he runs his whole brand about, you know, doing walking tours and whatnot. And I also had, and this is on the Black Expat website, Julia Brown, who's from Canada, who also did a lot of, this was before it was a thing as well, sort of these Black history tours and education. And it's very interesting to me when I hear kind of, you know, like your experiences, because I worked at a university where they had a similar program. Almost always the most popular, like, thing, right? didn't matter, especially amongst Black American students, right? It's almost like it's super hard to even to get into it because there's only so many spots. It's, at a particular time of year. But the history and the literature and the politics and how I think particularly as you see yourself as a Black person and depending, what your history is. This is the thing I always used to tell folks about study abroad, especially with Black students. They almost overwhelmingly love experiences where they can kind of tie it to their own experiences and they can see themselves. Those are always going to be the most popular, right? Like
100%.
They will go to London, they'll go to other places, and that's cool. But if you've got one that specifically focuses on somebody's Black history, don't even have to be their Black history, they are like, how do I go? Because I want to learn. And so what did for you on that experience? I mean, obviously this is your first international experience, and obviously the focal point is Black Paris and Black history. What was that like for you? Like, what do you think? I not to assume it was a transformational experience, but what for you do you think kind of clicked once you had that experience or while you were on it?
That's a really interesting question because I think a lot of the things that clicked for me about Paris Noir happened after I started living in Paris full time, because it's just so interesting to see the perception of Americans abroad, the perception of African Americans abroad, and the perception of Africans abroad. So I feel like there's a lot of dynamics at play here that when you're there for a specific, like it was a 6-week program, so it was a short period of time. And although we did kind of get into like race and like race politics and perception of different people in different spaces, when I really started living here, I think I got a better sense of what I had experienced previously during this study abroad program. But all in all, I think my big takeaway from having that experience was just that Black people are everywhere and they're doing amazing things everywhere in all different periods of time in history. And it might not be something that you learn about traditionally, but when you take the time to really go deeper into those stories, like Josephine Baker, for example, it's just really fascinating to see the different cultural ties and geopolitical ties that exist.
Yeah. I feel like that's a big takeaway for a lot of Black folks, at least coming from like the States or Canada, right? It may be a little bit different if you're coming from other countries, but like this, okay, there are Black people everywhere and they really are doing amazing things. And, there's so much gaps in our teaching in terms of history, right?
Yeah.
That I think that to be very honest, I think it's just affirmative for a lot of Black folks just to be like, no, we've been here and we've been doing things and contrary to what doesn't get showcased, these things live on and we're still influenced by it. And so, you mentioned, obviously, you're right. 6 weeks is a short amount of time. And I'd be very curious, did you, being in Paris, you're still Black American at that age or at that time, did you have any observations in terms of like racial politics or dynamics, not necessarily from the study abroad experience, just from observing or being part of like the French community and kind of seeing things at play? Was there anything that kind of stuck out at you, or were you just really kind of immersed in, I'm just trying to soak in being in Paris?
Yeah, that's a good question also, because I'm trying to think what my biggest kind of standout moments were for that program. And I think they were just the conversations that we had with the guest speakers that came in, and just about this concept of colorblind France. And I guess in the US, racism is very overt. It's very in your face. You'll have a lot of stories about certain incidences that happened where people were calling people names and like all of these different things. And I guess on a global scale, that looks very, that's like the definition of racism. But then you go to other places and racism might look different. And I think the perception of France that I think a lot of people had is that France is, colorblind, and that they really focus on integration and like everyone is a part of the French ecosystem. There's no race. They don't even have like race statistics and that kind of thing. But I think the program really showed just like the nuances of what it could look like and how it really takes place, which is something I hadn't really thought about in detail before this program.
I think it's a really good point. And I've had conversations with many a European, particularly because, well, here's the thing about the US. The US is large. We have one of the largest Black populations, right? And then we also have probably the largest or one of the largest media apparatuses in the world, right? And so, you could be on, like, we know this thing, Black Twitter. It's like, what's Black Twitter? I never know how to define it to anybody. I'm like, if you know, like, you there. It's like, there are things I see on Twitter and I want to explain to a friend. I'm like, you're not even going to understand. Like, there's so many layers and nuances to how this one meme is here. But like, so I've had folks be like, well, you guys talk about race all the time, but here and it's not just France. I can see this with the Netherlands or whatever. And folks are like, well, we're colorblind and we don't look at color. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's not true, because actually you don't overtly say you look at color, but when you actually look at the fabric of your society and who's where and who's doing what and who's in certain communities and who's not, you are color aware. It's just, you just think it's impolite to actually to call it out. Whereas Americans don't have that hang up, right? And then there are other parts of the world.
It's all in the history of how each society evolved. Like, America is still dealing with slavery. France has colonialism. I think these two things, that defines what the manifestation would look like today. So. Right.
Well, and I think there's also layers of privilege too, right? So that's the other part that's intertwined. And I've had this conversation with some other folks who live in France, and, sometimes the experiences are very different. I think you even alluded to it, being Black American versus, coming from maybe Senegal or coming from Morocco. I mean, we can get to that's a whole nother color conversation, but do you know what I mean? Or coming from Cote d'Ivoire or Benin or whatever. And so if that was your experience in France, how long were you in India?
India was, I think, a 4 or 5 week program. And we're in Mumbai for 3 to 4 weeks. And then we had a couple days in Delhi.
So how did that experience align? Because at that point you'd already had your French experience, right?
Yes.
How did that align with, this is now a new study abroad experience in a totally different continent, in a totally different culture, in a totally different context?
Yes. India was something I was so excited for because, again, it was Bollywood and that was just so attractive to me. But the whole point of the program actually was to learn about Indian cinema beyond Bollywood. So there are tons of other manifestations of Indian cinema that don't include song and dance and in different languages and all of these things. So for me, that was the huge pull of going there. And then also to go to a non-Eurocentric country as a study abroad experience, since I'd already been to Paris, which was in Europe. So for me, I just kind of went with an open mind to just experience this culture. And I was with a group of friends that, I had known before the study abroad program, and it was a very small, intimate group, maybe like 10 of us. So it was a really amazing experience for me. And I think it really affirmed the fact that I wanted to live in France after graduation, to the sense where it was, I want to work in the film, television, cinema media industry, but in a foreign country, because there's more than Hollywood. There's more than what America is and has to offer. And I think storytelling in its different forms in an international perspective is just so interesting. Like, that's what really kind of allowed me to have these two comparative experiences. And then, for me, that was just like the most exciting thing that I could do after graduation.
And in some ways, I think you probably already answered this question, because it's the same question I was thinking about when you mentioned France, was there a transformative moment or situation that happened for you in India that kind of made you sort of pivot in your thinking in terms of, race, politics, social strata, just international living? Did you have that?
I don't know if I had a transformational moment in India. For me, I think my favorite part of that experience was working on a short film with a few other people from the program. And we were able to work in schools and work with students who were living in slums. So they were going to this like special program that would allow them to, advance in their education and in their life and kind of support their family. So just being able to see these different dynamics in another country, not just like poverty, but just literally how people live, how people interact with each other, what the situation is. And for me, that was kind of like, okay, like, there's just so many different ways to experience life. And for me, so many stories that I feel like need to be told. So I feel like that was my big, takeaway from India. It was a really beautiful country and a really beautiful experience.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I'm dragging you down memory lane, but when you're saying
Yeah,
like, I
honestly,
actually have to think about all these things, but you know what?
No, yeah, honestly, India feels so far away, but so close just because of the group that I went with. And like, I constantly see like our pictures resurface, and we went to the
On social
Taj
media?
together. Yeah, it was like a whole thing. I'm so glad that I was able to do that while I was a student.
So I think it's safe to say that after both of these experiences, did it sort of solidify in your mind that you were going to move abroad? I mean, obviously France was in your sights, right? But would you say that happened?
Yes, those two experiences were definitely a huge factor as to me even having the courage or the thought or the volition to just say, I'm going to leave America and just go to a foreign country and live there completely.
And so did you, and I'm wondering this as a college student or even after, did you, if you had decided that France was where you were going to go, did you start practicing the language? Like, or were you just like, I'm just going to show up, we're going to make this work?
Oh man, I remember a conversation that I had with a former professor. So I was actually a dual major at Syracuse. I did in the Maxwell School's public policy program, and then in the Newhouse School's television, radio, and film. So I had always kind of had this double plan or like this dual major kind of situation where I loved media and I loved storytelling, but I also loved like the world and like politics and the economy and just like this kind of concept of politics almost. So I remember talking with this professor and I was like, yeah, like, I think I'm going to move to France after I graduate. And he was like, Whitney, like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Like, he was kind of like, what do you mean? Like, what are you going to do for like a job? Or like, what are you planning to like do with your life? And I was like, yeah, I'm going to move to France. Like, that's my big plan.
Such a plan.
And I actually applied to the Middlebury School's like summer language program. I was like, oh my God, like I took 2 semesters of French in college and it was mostly horrible. Like I think I was so embarrassed to talk. I felt like my French was just horrible. And so I was like, I need to do this language program. I need to learn French and then I can go to France and like do all of these things. But then, life kind of got in the way. I needed to get a job. So I started working in New York for about 2 years. And then before I really made the move to France, I decided to take classes at Alliance Française. So that was maybe 6 months where I was just learning French after work. And yeah, that was what kind of prepared me to say, all right, I'm gonna go.
All right, so we're back from the break, and as you were listening, we got Whitney up to Paris. She hadn't yet gone to France yet, so she kind of built up the anticipation. And so, here's always the question for anyone who comes on here and they're in a country and, they've been there for a minute. What did you do when you got there? Because most people were thinking about moving somewhere like, how does this work? So you had a job and you were learning the language and, your background, as you have talked about, your educational background anyway, has been in film and production. And then there's some public policy studying as well that you did. So how did you take your skills and your abilities over to France? Like, what did you do?
Yeah, so I think the whole experience thus far for me has been complete, like, kismet, So I was trying to figure out if I should move to France as a student because that's the most accessible way. And then I later decided that the most accessible way for someone that does not have money is to become an au pair. So that was my entryway into France. Mm-hmm. I was an au pair for a full year with a French family and I lived with them. And I had a 6-year-old little girl that I took after school. And for me, it was kind of amazing because it was a reverse gap year in a way. So I had gone from working like a 40-hour-a-week job to working, I think, 12 hours a week, just hanging out with like this kid. Yeah, which was like really amazing to, have this cultural experience living with the family, understanding France, basically, how it works, how it's set up, what the structure is, what people do. And then also having this time to travel and just kind of like redefine myself, understand what I'm looking for in life and all of these things. So that was my first year and kind of entryway into Paris.
I think you might be the second person I've had who said for them it was being an au pair. That was like the start of their story. We were joking off about my older episodes, which whatever. Y'all should still listen to them. I mean, they don't sound techie the same way they sound now, but they were good. And episode number 2, I believe I had Abby Gugu Banda, who has been on the Black Expat, and she's from South Africa. And so for her experience coming to the US initially was working with families and being an au pair. I mean, she's since launched into being an estate manager and working for the really wealthy, but it started with that. And so, yeah, that's a really interesting way. I don't think, and I don't know how common I've had Black folks who said they've done that. I've definitely had other folks. And so that I'm thinking that was, I don't know if other people in your family were like, wait, you're going to go to Paris and do what?
That's so funny. I think my family was just like, yeah, go ahead. Like there was no any kind of anything. They were like, yeah, go ahead, do that. Why not?
Seems like a really good way to get to France. And so, yeah. I mean, and honestly, it's a really interesting way to, I think, get paid, at least have some living expenses, like your living expenses covered, and to see a country, right? And to see a culture. Because, I mean, every family is different, but being in a French family, right? If you're going to practice your French, that's probably the way to do it, right? Is to be embedded.
Yes. I remember I came with an au pair agency, and I specifically requested to be with a family where I would be able to primarily speak French, because it was my goal to really learn the language that first year. So I only spoke English with my au pair kid on Wednesdays, and that was like because Wednesday is like a big day in France where kids aren't in school up to a certain age. So you have a bunch of activities and you're always like, keeping them busy on Wednesday. So that was our like big English day. But other than that, my goal is, to really just like immerse myself and to learn French.
And so when your year was up, what was sort of your next steps? Because obviously you did not stay being an au pair, because that was a 1-year contract or 1-year experience.
Yeah, it was just 1 year. And I guess I was considering a couple of different things after that year. I was thinking of being an English teacher, because that seemed like another way to kind of be in like a secure situation, and like maybe I could do grad school at the same time. And then I was, applying to grad school. So they have this thing in France. I'm not sure if it's something that we do in America, but it's called an apprenticeship. So basically you're able to go to school and you work at the same time. So I was accepted into grad school, and I went to grad school maybe 1 week of a month. And then the other time I was actually working. So I was employed with a company, and my studies were focused on production, and my job was actually in distribution.
Wow. I mean, I think the closest thing we have in the US, definitely at the undergrad level, not sure they have it at the graduate level, but they probably do, is co-ops, where if you think about it, like it's sort of the same concept where you work and you go to school. And sometimes when students are doing co-op, they don't necessarily graduate in the traditional 4 years, because maybe they, depending on the breakdown, it might be like a semester working with an engineering firm and then their classes or however it breaks up. So yeah, we have something kind of like that, maybe not to the same extent, but it does sort of exist. Okay. So just for clarification, when we're saying production and distribution, we're talking about within the film space, correct?
So the program was called Production Audiovisuelle. And basically it's a master's where you learn kind of the whole industry. So how film financing and television financing works in France. So this, you can kind of either follow a film or a more like television route, depending on what you want to do.
So you were very clear, obviously, in pursuing that master's, but and obviously based on what you studied in undergrad, you were very clear that you were going to figure out how to still be within the film space, because that's what you've been doing and the production space, now just doing it in France, correct?
Yeah. So for me, it was interesting because in the US, my career after graduating was mostly focused on documentaries. So I had been working with AmDoc, American Documentary, and that was in a more like curatorial space for POV and America Reframed. But then I was doing kind of like freelance producing and associate producing, working on just like a lot of different projects that weren't particularly television or film. They were mostly like digital or like written content. So then when I moved here, it was really about learning the French system and kind of like how and where I could see myself in that system. So my degree was focused on production. And then, as I said, like my day job was really distribution.
Gotcha. And so how long did you stay in that day job?
Yeah, so I'm still there.
Yay for jobs.
Hey. Wait, well, I'm still at the same company, but not in the same position.
I just realized we probably should put a timestamp on this. So what year did you move to France officially?
Yeah, so I moved to France in 2017 in September. Okay. So it's been almost 5 years now. Yeah.
Yeah. Look at that. You've been there for a minute. No. And so how has your job changed in from what you started doing to what you're doing now? Are you doing something different? Like, what are the nuances?
Completely. So when I was in my apprenticeship, it was, I guess I would say an assistant sales account manager, because my focus was really on understanding like the business side of the distribution, doing like, just kind of like analyzing and reporting on like the sales numbers and that kind of thing. And it was much more of like an administrative position. And then afterwards, I moved to a sales assistant position. And that's where I'm really working with the sales managers and working on selling the rights to our documentaries abroad internationally.
And so was it for you, as obviously someone who's not, or at least as far as I am assuming, not a French citizen, was it hard for you to find these opportunities? Because you know, like, first of all, you're in the film and you're in the art space, and then you're outside of your home country. So how was it difficult to find it, even get into the door, or was it because you'd done your master's and that kind of led you to these next steps that made it easier?
I will say that the job market in France might be a little slower than in the US. I feel like it might be easier to kind of just like move around or like quit your job and go do something else than the US. I feel like in France, people keep their jobs for longer. So there's two different types of contracts that you can have in France. One is a CDD, which is a fixed duration contract. And then you have a CDI, which is essentially like a long-term open-ended contract. So it's like the kind of like the French success model is like to have your CDI, your like CDI, and you have this contract and you're able to, you know, have real stability, like being in this company. So I feel like people don't give those up too easily. So once you can kind of, secure that, you know, your goal might be to like move up in that company and like achieve a certain level of success where you are. So for me, I was, in a CDD in my, apprenticeship contract, and then eventually I got my CDI. And since then I've been able to kind of like grow and evolve in this team and in this structure. But I would have to say that it would have been harder for me if I, you know, had tried to come in directly to get this like long-term contract or like at a different level. So I think it's all about relationships, and it's all about timing and the opportunities that literally exist when you're applying for them.
So I'm completely fascinated by this, and I'm going to ask this question because you've created and produced your own series, and we'll talk about that. From your perspective, especially where you're working, does storytelling look a little bit different in France than it has maybe when you were in the US and working on documentaries, or is there a particular point of view or the way that it's done that's similar to how we do it in the US?
I think storytelling is universal, but definitely the way in which it is executed is different internationally. And that's actually a big kind of concept in terms of distribution. Like your content has to be like palatable or very interesting from an international perspective, in the way that like a certain topic can be covered or like broken down. Like there's a very like American way, I guess. And then there's maybe a French way or like an international way of breaking down the same topic. Yeah. So I would say the French way is I guess I would say maybe softer or more like introspective, where you're really going to take the time to like develop something and like maybe go a little bit slower and like deeper into a subject. And I think the American way might be a little, I wouldn't say formulaic, but I would say like there are key points that you have to hit to really engage an audience and like make sure that they're following along and they're going to really stick with you with the program. So yeah, that's a really good question. It's interesting to think about that.
Okay, so I'm wondering, in light of your response, if if the storytelling is a reflection of the culture, like of of where you're telling the story. So my point being is that you're saying that the French could be a little bit softer, more introspective, where in the US, we do have it. It could be far more formulaic and whatnot. And I'm wondering if it's also the intentionality of we have to have a certain number of folks to see this. We have to get the maximum amount of people who are able to see this project. Is it an attention span thing? Like, I'm just kind of curious as to maybe why you think maybe American storytelling is a little bit different.
I think it depends on the content as well. And yeah, I guess maybe there is like a specific number that has to be achieved in terms of audience or streams or whatnot, but respectively, like in France as well as in the US. But I think the approach might just be different because of the audiences. Like in the US, they might be accustomed to a certain type of thing. And in France, they might be accustomed to a different type of thing. And that's what will, satiate their audiences. And they're going to keep driving that format because it's what people are expecting and what they want to see.
And we will drive a format to the ground until let me not say that. We're on like Real Housewives of what now? I don't think I've ever seen a full episode, and people are like, yeah, this happened 15 seasons ago on Atlanta or Beverly Hills, and I'm just like, y'all, it seems to me like it's the same concept that's been going on for a minute, but it works, right? And it makes money. So I can see that. All right. So here's what I think is cool. Obviously you have a job and you're aligned with what you did your master's in or your degree in. But it seems like you have still continued to do your own storytelling and you still continue to have your own point of view in the work that you're doing. And so I want you to talk a little bit about it's funny because it's a web series and it was a podcast, Current. And I want to talk a little bit about why you decided to do that and what was sort of driving you to sort of do your storytelling the way you've been doing it.
Yeah, that's a really good question because I went back and forth with whether or not this would be a podcast or a web series. And I think COVID is really like the response to that in the sense that it started out as a web series and I really wanted to bring people together to have these conversations. And Current, the web series and podcast is really just conversations bringing together French speaking and English speaking people to talk about, several different concepts and topics that I think are important for the millennial generation. So in these episodes, we talk about capitalism, work culture, relationships, and the representation of youth in the media. And at first we shot a pilot, and the pilot was, a web series. Mm-hmm. And I shot with the same group of people, both in English and in French. And it was very interesting to see, would this make more sense as a podcast, as a web series? Like, what does each format really give? And how can I really, capture people's attention with what I'm trying to bring forward? And then by the time it came around to shoot the entire series, I just really couldn't decide. And I said, you know what? I'm going to produce both and see what really speaks to me and what speaks to the audience in terms of the format that really works for this content.
There are a couple of things that struck me. Number one, web, for anyone who's created any content, audio versus web, they're two different animals, right? I mean, in your mind, if you're listening to this podcast, it's one thing to hear it. It's a different thing to see it. And I honestly, sidebar, I was reading these random debates over folks who were like, I see all these audio podcasts that are moving towards YouTube, and they felt like there were a lot of people actually who feel like that takes away from the audio perspective because you can do other things and listen to it. And also when people are on camera, it's a little, you react, let's be honest. I mean,
they
I
have a
think
different
I
posture.
Yeah, exactly. Because like right now, ain't nobody can see us. I mean, whatever. Like, like I don't care. But then you put a camera on, all of a sudden, full disclosure, put makeup on.
Yeah, right? You want to look a certain
look presentable way. Because it'll live on in infamy on Google, right? So I think the fact that you did an audio and a web version, that's a really interesting way in terms of storytelling, just because you're right. How people present and how they share can be very different. Now, the second thing, though, that really got me is the fact that you did it in two languages. Like, you had these conversations in two languages. I gave a talk a few weeks ago, and I was talking about, one of the things I talked about was people's heart languages, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure, as someone now who speaks French, right? And if you've ever studied more than one language, I say that there's the heart language, which is just the language you just need. Like, little kid, that's the language you learn. That's the language you are probably the most expressive in. And then there's the learned languages. And some people can be incredibly expressive in a second, third, fourth language that they've learned. But there's something about the way I can say something in English versus the way maybe I could say it in French. And God forbid, I can't really say it in Spanish right now because I'm still learning. But do you know what I mean? And so I was very intrigued, especially when you think about like the first group who you said you had them do it in English and then they had to do it in French. Did you see dynamics change either with the group or even with what people had said in one language, but then what it looked like in the second language?
Yes. And that was the big test for me of the pilot episode, was to really see, does it make sense to have the same group of people kind of responding, but in a different language? Because their personalities will be different in another language, but is the content really different? Like, what am I really, sharing if it's the same group of people? So I felt it was really important to have two different groups of people, even if it's the same topic, for the series in one language or the other. So for me, just as like someone who learned French, I definitely feel like I have two different personalities in each language. And I think it's evident when you try to really get into your feelings or like express certain things, like your heart language, you go back to what you know and what you can really articulate the way you want to articulate it. And I think that's why the casting was so, so important. And it was the most fun of this entire process for me, because I was able to really put people together that I thought would be able to have a connection, people who weren't necessarily speaking their mother tongue, but would still be able to really connect and engage and have that conversation.
And how were you able to find the guests and your panelists for your show? Were these people that you knew, or was it referrals or references, or where did they come from?
Yeah, so I scoured the internets and I exploited all of my friends. That's basically it. No, so I had an amazing production assistant, and she went to a journalism school, so she was able to really like help me with the casting process. And between the two of us, we found 25 individuals. I want to say maybe like at least 30% were my close friends that agreed to just kind of show up and really talk about these issues. And the other people we found through Facebook, our own personal networks, even like Instagram. I feel like I reached out to a couple people that I just thought had a really cool dynamic. So yeah, that was pretty much it. And it was crazy because the timing was interesting. I had taken like a week off of work to just like focus on this project. And, it was like the middle of the day, like who would be available to like show up for this like 2-hour conversation and really just like, be present to talk about it. So it was interesting, but it was really great.
Yeah. People have no idea how hard it is sometimes to scour talent and subject. Like if you've never done it, it is just like, I have this idea. I have this concept because we did back in 2017. I actually want to bring it back now that we're kind of getting out of COVID, a web series, like a very short one on just kind of Black folks in very specific areas. And the amount of like figuring out, hey, do you have time on this random day for us to shoot at maybe where you're at work and to do whatever. So I'm totally sympathetic. And so, you've concluded season 1, and that concluded, the last sort of wrapping up aired in February of this year. And so, with these conversations and these dialogues, what is sort of your plan kind of going forward? Is this something that you see continuing on, or is this like a limited series, or has it sort of changed the trajectory of what you think you want to do and film?
Yes. So for me, I would love to continue with the season 2. I would love to think about topics that are continuing to be engaging for the millennial generation, and finding a whole new group of people to really explore that with. For me, I'd like to bring on maybe like a director to bring on maybe an artistic approach. The first season was really just a set of conversations, and it was people just seated, together having these exchanges. But maybe I can change the dynamic in season 2 with a little bit of like elevated cinematography. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I definitely want to continue to create this content and to share this content and really to see how it's received. I think that's the biggest thing. Like you can, work on something and put it on the internet, and the biggest thing is really seeing how people interact with it and what people think about it. So I think that's my big project for, season 1, even to continue to put it online and share these stories. And then also thinking about how to approach season 2 to the point where, I'm able to like grow my audience and find people who are really interested in these conversations.
And so since you successfully obviously have done season 1 and this is kind of your professional space, do you see yourself sort of expanding out into other stories or other mechanisms to sort of connect with folks? In other words, where do you sort of see yourself as you continue to like dive into this digital content area?
Yes, that's an amazing question, because there are a lot of shows that I had seen in this space before I created Current that I was really inspired by. I don't know if you've ever heard of Cecilia Meike's Strolling series.
Yep.
Yes.
I think she follows us, actually.
Really? Amazing.
Yeah.
I just remember seeing that when I was in college, and they were basically Strolling. If anyone listening doesn't know about it, it's a series of conversations with people about Blackness in various different spaces. So Cecilia Meike, I think she's from the UK. She might be Jamaican as well. So she started in the UK, and she just had these individual portraits of these people, just, walking on the street, and they were just so intimate and like so well done. And I just really was inspired by that. And I love that. And I wanted to kind of create my own version of this, ability to tell the story of people in different places and different spaces and how they interact and how they, understand the world. So yeah, I could completely see myself, picking up different formats and different projects that are continuously, in line with that vision of these two stories that, people have within them. Like if it's 2 different languages or 2 different cultures that they really want to express and bring forward, and, what that means for who they are and what their generation has to say about the world.
I am so glad you brought up Strolling, because Strolling, man, was the bomb. Like, and here's the thing, and you couldn't, so she had it was on YouTube, and then it disappeared for a while, and then I know it's back.
It got acquired. Oh, really?
It like you can now, it's back in terms of you can now watch it, because I remember I was like, we would link to it, and I'm like, where did it go? Those stories were really good. And then it disappeared. And then I think late last year, because I follow her on Twitter, and so she's pretty active on Twitter these days, and it's now back up. And I would say same, like we had I feel like Strolling came out just yesterday, but it did not. But we had our own web series, which was not Strolling, which, by the way, the reason, if y'all don't know, it's called Strolling is like basically take a walk and talk, and you see all these great young Black folks telling their stories. But when we did our web series, I remember she was kind of a little bit in the back of my head, because I was like, yeah, that's very similar to how I kind of vision our folks were not strolling. They were chilling in very cool locations, but they were not strolling. And so you're right. I could definitely see like her, like that kind of influence, because I don't know about you, but I love seeing, and in your case, I know that yours is it's a mixed group, but I just love seeing in my vein, like Black folks just kind of dissecting some of these topics in a very nuanced way.
Yeah.
And not in a very, it's not necessarily dramatic. It's not necessarily hyped up. It's like, this is like, it scratches an intellectual itch, if you will, even if I don't agree with their points, just to say, hey, we definitely think about these things in a very deeper level. And it's not just, pop culture references.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the thing, like having these different topics to really dissect and to explore. I don't know if it's something that people think about every day or if it's something that's kind of like in the back of their mind. But just hearing other people talk about it, I think can really, open up your mind to what you thought about a specific thing. Like I remember watching the capitalism episode during editing. I was like, wow, like I love hearing these different perspectives, especially for the French capitalism episode, for the English capitalism episode, we had someone from the UK, someone from China, and someone from the US. So I feel like it got really like, interesting to see them share their unique perspective based on where they're from.
Absolutely. And so I guess the question begs, I like to ask this of all my folks who are expatting. You've been in Paris for about 5 years now, right?
Yeah, almost.
So do we look like we're staying in France for at least the immediate future for a while? Or are there other places that tend to pop up?
Yeah, it's weird. I feel so at home here now. I feel like France is definitely my second home, and I've had the opportunity to travel, beyond Paris to different regions in France, and it's all very beautiful, and it's all like, wow, like I don't know, what does my life look like here? So I definitely see myself staying here longer. Forever, I have no idea. But I love the idea of potentially going to the Middle East. I love the idea of maybe going back home for a period of time. But I do know that Paris and France will always be like really, really special to me and a place where I'll definitely spend a decent amount of time in my life.
You've just listened to an episode of The Global Chatter, which is hosted by me, Amanda Bates. It is edited by Stephanie Ficcio. Don't forget to subscribe to The Global Chatter on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us on Instagram at The Global Chatter, or stop by Twitter and find us at Global Chat Pod. If you have a question, want to subscribe to the newsletter, or are interested in sponsoring, visit theglobalchatter.com.